The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the normal kind. Not the peaceful early morning silence you get before birds start up and sprinklers click on. I mean the dead kind. The kind that makes your skin tighten before your brain catches up. No modem lights in the office window. No hum from the small network cabinet in my workshop. No status pings on my phone. Then I looked toward the fence line and saw the orange conduit lying open in the dirt like something had been gutted. And standing 10 yards away with hedge shears in one hand and a smug smile on her face was Diane Kessler, president of the Cottonwood Trails HOA. She lifted her sunglasses, glanced at the severed cable, and said the sentence that would end up costing her neighborhood more money than any landscaping dispute in county history. It was hideous. At first, I honestly thought she was joking. Because no sane adult walks onto private property and cuts a marked communications line with garden tools just because they don't like the color. But Diane wasn't sane, and she definitely wasn't joking. What she also didn't know, what she should have known before trespassing at 7 in the morning and slicing through utility-marked fiber, was that the ugly orange cable she'd destroyed wasn't just feeding my property. It was a protected temporary bypass tied into the county's rural trunk relay during a storm recovery reroute. In simple terms, she hadn't just cut off my internet, she had just touched the wrong line in the wrong easement on the worst possible day. And by the time county crews started tracing the outage, half the sheriff's substations, 3 schools, the clinic uplink, and most of the West Valley were bleeding service. That was the moment I stopped being annoyed and started wondering how many different ways one HOA president could ruin her own life before lunch. My name is Evan Mercer, and I own 9 acres just outside Red Hollow, Oregon. I bought the place in 2022 after leaving a network infrastructure job in Portland that paid well, burned hot, and nearly wrecked me. I wanted space, land, quiet. I wanted mornings that began with trees instead of traffic, and work that ended when the sun did instead of whenever some executive realized a system migration had gone sideways. The property had an old farmhouse, a detached workshop, and enough cleared slope to keep me busy forever. It also sat beside Cottonwood Trails, a polished little HOA development built on what used to be orchard land before somebody with money and a drone camera decided rustic luxury was the future. That meant I lived beside the kind of neighborhood that loved the idea of country life as long as no one had equipment, utility work, trailers, mud, fencing, delivery trucks, or visible infrastructure, which, unfortunately for them, described most real property. I worked remotely half the week, consulting on rural networking projects and municipal recovery systems. Because of that, I had an upgraded communications line running from the county easement box across my north boundary to the workshop. It wasn't random, it wasn't illegal, it was permitted, marked, inspected, and documented, especially after a winter windstorm had damaged older routing and the county authorized a temporary bypass path through existing service easements. The line was housed in bright orange protective conduit, bright enough that even a child would understand it wasn't decorative garden edging, bright enough that "do not cut" might as well have been written across it in fire. Diane Kessler hated it on site. The first complaint came 3 days after the install. A formal HOA letter, which was funny because I wasn't part of the HOA. It said several residents had expressed concern over industrial visual blight visible from premium western lots. That was Diane language. Nobody else on earth uses phrases like premium western lots unless they think property values are a religion. I ignored it. Then she came to my door. Diane was in her late 50s, tightly put together, always wearing neutral-colored sweaters that somehow looked judgmental, and she had perfected the expression of a woman who thought every inconvenience in the world had been personally designed to disrespect her. "Mr. Mercer," she said, standing on my porch with a clipboard, "that cable casing is unacceptable. It's permitted utility conduit. It's bright orange. Yes, it's visible from the community trail. It's on my land." She gave me the smile. The one HOA people save for moments when they think law is just a phase you'll grow out of. Communities function better when neighbors cooperate. That word again. Cooperate. What she meant was obey. I said no. Not rudely, not loudly, just clearly. And people like Diane always take a calm no worse than an insult. After that, the complaints multiplied. The conduit was aesthetic pollution. The county access flags near the easement were visual trash. My utility markers were unsafe for children, which was impressive considering the nearest child would have had to cross a drainage swale and 2 fences to reach them. Then came the real reason. At a county meeting about runoff and road maintenance, Diane cornered me near the coffee urn and said, almost casually, "If you buried the line deeper and farther east, it would restore visual integrity for the ridge homes." That sounded harmless until you knew the site. Farther east meant outside the approved easement and into rocky ground that would have cost me a small fortune to trench and repath. "You want me to pay to move lawful utility routing because your residents don't like orange?" She smiled. "I want you to be reasonable." I said, "No, you want scenery." Her smile vanished. That was the first time I saw the real Diane under the performance. Cold, thin-skinned, mean. "You're creating unnecessary conflict," she said. "No," I told her. "You're standing on my side of it." She walked away after that, but not before saying something that sat in my head all week. "This will get handled." Now, in normal life, that line means paperwork. With Diane, it meant escalation. 2 weeks later, county crews came out for routine checks on the reroute. They replaced a marker, tested signal integrity, and left me a notice reminding all adjacent landowners not to tamper with visible conduit during the temporary bypass period. I kept a copy in the workshop. Good thing. Because Diane escalated exactly the way people like her always do, through a mix of fake confidence and catastrophic ignorance. The day before she cut the line, I found 2 HOA landscaping contractors standing near the easement fence taking pictures. One of them looked embarrassed, the other looked bored. Diane was with them. She tapped the orange conduit with the end of a pen and said, "We're documenting nuisance materials. That's county-marked communications infrastructure. It's an eyesore. You're trespassing." She looked straight at me and said, "I'm solving a problem." That was Diane in one sentence. I called County Utility Services after she left and reported the interaction. They logged it, told me not to worry, and said any tampering with marked communications route would be taken seriously. That should have been enough. It wasn't. The next morning, I woke to dead silence. Then I found the cable. The orange conduit had been hacked through in 2 places and peeled open. Fiber strands glinted in the dirt like hair in morning frost. Diane stood nearby with hedge shears in one hand and a white travel mug in the other. "It was hideous," she repeated when I demanded to know what she'd done. "You cut a live line. It was temporary. That doesn't mean you get to destroy it. It crossed near community sightlines. It crossed my easement." She rolled her eyes. "You engineers always act like everything is life support." Then my phone started vibrating in my pocket. Once, twice, then nonstop. Alerts, system route failures, network loss, county service degradation notices, rural uplink failover messages. My stomach dropped. I looked past Diane toward the county box at the road and back at the severed cable. This wasn't just my workshop feed. The bypass had been carrying active overflow load from the storm reroute that morning. A lot of it. I said very quietly, "You need to put those down and step away." For the first time, she looked uncertain. "What?" I was already dialing county operations. "This is Evan Mercer. The north bypass line on easement segment 4B has been physically cut." "Yes." "By a person standing here?" "No, I'm not guessing. Send everybody." Diane's face changed as she heard that. "It can't be that serious." I looked at her and said, "You may have just blacked out half the valley." She laughed once nervously. "No." Then the first sheriff SUV flew past the entrance road 10 minutes later without slowing. Then another. Then a county utility truck. Then two more. That was when Diane stopped talking. The next 3 hours were controlled chaos. County crews sealed the area, tested the box, and confirmed what I already suspected. During overnight balancing after an unrelated damage event west of town, traffic had been pushed through the temporary bypass to stabilize regional service. Translation? The line Diane cut had become far more important than she understood. Sheriff substation terminals dropped. Clinic records uplink degraded. School network service went dark. Emergency comm redundancy failed over and started choking secondary paths. Nobody died. Nobody got hurt physically. But for about 90 minutes, the county had a real infrastructure problem because an HOA president thought orange conduit looked tacky. That sentence never stopped being incredible to me. Diane tried to pivot fast. She told the first field supervisor she thought the line was abandoned construction waste. That lasted until he saw the fresh county markers and the warning tags zip-tied along the fence. Then she tried claiming it was on HOA-adjacent land. That died the moment the parcel map came out. Then she tried saying she had only trimmed around it. The hedge shears in her hand still had orange insulation fragments stuck near the hinge. You can't outperform evidence when you're holding it. A county investigator took my statement right there by the workshop, while crews spliced and rewrote it around the damage. I showed him the prior HOA letters, Diane's complaint emails, the photos from the day before, and the report number from the utility warning call I'd made after she threatened to handle it. His expression got flatter with every page. "Did she know what it was?" he asked. "Yes." "You told her directly?" "Multiple times." He nodded slowly, which in law enforcement language usually means someone else's afternoon just got much worse. They took Diane's statement next. I couldn't hear all of it, but I heard enough. It was an aesthetic nuisance. That phrase again, aesthetic. As if property damage becomes elegant if you call it landscaping. By noon, Cottonwood Trails residents were coming out in clusters near the fence line, watching county trucks and sheriff vehicles with the same confused look people wear when neighborhood nonsense suddenly intersects with real-world consequences. One of the residents, a guy I only knew as Mark from Lot 18, walked up and asked me, "Did she really cut a county line?" "Looks that way." He looked back toward the trucks, then toward Diane, who was now sitting in a folding chair someone had brought her, like she was recovering from an ordeal instead of causing one. "Jesus," he muttered. Exactly. By late afternoon, the story inside Cottonwood Trails had already split in two. Diane's version, an unfortunate misunderstanding involving temporary construction material. Reality, deliberate destruction of marked communications infrastructure after weeks of documented complaints and repeated warnings. Reality won quickly. County crews restored service, but the repair wasn't cheap. Emergency dispatch rerouting, field labor, restoration work, and incident response all cost money. Serious money. And because the line had been tied into county recovery routing, the county treated it exactly the way you'd expect. Not as a petty neighbor dispute, but as infrastructure interference. That phrase hit the HOA board like a hammer. The board president wasn't Diane alone. Technically, she was chair, but the association still had officers, counsel, insurance, and reserves. By evening, their attorney was calling me. He sounded tired before he even introduced himself. "Mr. Mercer, the association would like to understand whether this matter can be de-escalated." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "Your president cut a marked county communications line with garden shears." "Yes," he said, and there was a long pause after that yes. "We understand this is serious." Serious. That was one word for it. I forwarded everything to my attorney, Elena Ruiz, who handled property and utility disputes and had a gift for sounding polite while ruining people financially. She reviewed the incident package and said exactly what I hoped she'd say. "She's done." Personally, or the HOA? She didn't miss a beat. Potentially both. Over the next week, things got uglier for Cottonwood Trails. The county sent a preservation demand, then a cost recovery notice, then a notice of potential civil action tied to intentional damage and emergency response expenses. The HOA insurer got involved and almost immediately started asking inconvenient questions like, why had the board received multiple prior complaints about the line? Why had Diane been warned it was active county-routed infrastructure? Why had no one stopped her? And my favorite? Why had Association Communications repeatedly described lawful utility conduit as a removable nuisance feature? That phrase showed up in Discovery. So did emails. Lots of them. One from Diane to the board said, if the county won't move it, we may need a direct visual remedy. Another said, orange utility clutter is depressing market perception from Western homes. Market perception. That was the real motive all along. Not safety, not community harmony, property values. A few ridge homes looked down onto the north boundary. Diane had convinced herself the conduit was hurting the neighborhood's premium image. And because people like her confuse preference with entitlement, she escalated from complaining to destruction without ever passing through the part of adulthood where consequences are considered. Elena moved fast. Trespass, property damage, interference with utility infrastructure, private nuisance by harassment, claim for security upgrades, claim for business interruption, all of it. The county pursued its own recovery track. The HOA board started fracturing immediately. One member resigned. Another publicly blamed Diane in a resident email leak that spread through the development in about 20 minutes. Then the really fun number came in. Preliminary county recovery and response costs, just over $418,000. That figure moved through Cottonwood Trails like a disease. Residents who'd once nodded politely at Diane's preserving standards speeches suddenly wanted to know why their reserve fund was now being discussed in relation to a woman with hedge shears and a personal vendetta against the color orange. I got the answer 2 weeks later at a settlement conference. The HOA's counsel, a county representative, Elena, and I sat in a conference room while Diane, pale, furious, and suddenly much quieter, watched from the far end of the table beside her own personal attorney. The proposal was brutal. A large portion of HOA reserves would be locked pending county recovery and civil claims. Diane would resign immediately. The HOA would issue a written retraction and acknowledgement that the conduit was lawful and protected. My property would get enhanced non-interference provisions and monitored boundary terms. And Diane, personally, would remain exposed for portions not covered by insurance if intentional misconduct exclusions held. When Elena slid the draft toward me, I read it once, then looked at Diane. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Good. Because for the first time since she stepped onto my land acting like aesthetics outranked utility law, she finally understood something simple. She hadn't cut a cable. She'd cut through the illusion that neighborhood power meant anything outside neighborhood rules. A month later, Cottonwood Trails voted her out officially. County recovery continued. The reserves took a hit. And yes, the title people used later wasn't technically precise, but it was close enough for storytelling. HOA cut my ugly orange cable, so I severed the trunk line for the whole county. Not with tools, not by revenge. With evidence. By letting the truth travel exactly where her shears had already sent it. Straight into every system she never should have touched. Now, every time I walk that fence line and see the replacement conduit, same bright orange, same lawful route, same tags, I smile. Because Diane was right about one thing. It was visible. Visible enough for everyone to remember what happens when petty people mistake infrastructure for decoration. How did you like the story? Subscribe to my YouTube channel.